Good morning, everyone. My name is Pietro Perona. I'm a professor at Caltech. My field is computer vision, and I've had the pleasure of collaborating with the chance to organize this meeting. This is a very momentous time as we see AI, so I should give you a little bit of perspective. I have been in the field for more than 30 years now, 35, and until 6 or 7 years ago, things weren't working. And so it was a beautiful little academic area where we would dream big and have little impact, which is also a privilege because then you're not, you can do things in peace in your office and with your students. And now all of a sudden things are working and we wonder where AI is going. As we saw yesterday very clearly, there is enormous potential for AI to help in the sciences, to make scientists more effective in their work and help them carry out many tasks that are maybe not the core of their job. And so everyone around the world is wondering where is this going and how is it going to develop. And we heard yesterday that there are many dimensions to this question. One is representations, one is algorithms, one is data, one is the sociology of science, how we share data, how we publish. All of that is in play. And I view this meeting as a pivotal moment in our coming together to understand how things go. There are people in this room who come from different fields and are seeing each other for the first time and are having those first conversations that will lead to great results in the future. So at Caltech, we are, of course, thinking about the same questions. And I've been thinking about this for maybe a year and a half now. Being here and seeing what we all saw has been enormously enriching for me. And so I would like to thank the chance for having the thought of putting this together and doing it so well, first time around, just bullseye, fantastic. And so I hope that we will have the chance to meet again in the future and track how things develop. It's my privilege to introduce the first speaker today. He's Chris Bishop. If this was a machine learning AI conference, I would need to put in no further introduction because Chris is legendary. He is the person who saw that machine learning could be cast in probabilistic terms, and through his work, his talks, and his textbooks, he influenced profoundly the field. I myself taught out of Chris's book for many years, and so I'm very grateful to him. He has had very influential positions. He joined Microsoft in the mid-90s when Microsoft was deciding to invest heavily in machine learning. And so this is 30 years ago. And so he was a leader with them, and he was the chief of the whole AI effort of Microsoft in Europe. Recently, he has been very much involved in thinking and doing what we're talking about today, namely thinking about how to use AI to help in the sciences. And I'm very curious to hear what he will talk about today. As you see from the title, it's nothing less than ambitious, the talk. And when we ask questions at the end, we should remember that he is perhaps the person we have in this meeting who has the longest track record and the biggest depth in thinking about this topic. And so, without saying more, I would like to give the microphone to Chris, who is talking to us remotely from the UK. Chris.
Thank you very much, Pietro. Thank you for the very kind words. I'm genuinely very frustrated that I can't be in San Francisco with you all. I'm very envious, but I am extremely grateful to have the opportunity to give this presentation. I think many people believe that AI will have a profound impact on many kinds of cognitive endeavors of humanity, and including, of course, science. the ability of LLMs to read the entire scientific literature, to reason, to act as agents, to drive autonomous labs, perhaps even act as AI scientists. These are all very profound potential developments that we may see in the next few years. What I want to talk about today, though, is something rather different. It's something that's very specific to science. As Pietro indicated, I've given it this rather grand title of the fifth paradigm of scientific discovery. But the reason for calling it out is, first of all, that it is quite transformational. You'll see several examples of this as we go through, but also it's very ubiquitous. And so I think by calling it out and giving it a name and giving it a label, it makes it much more explicit and encourages people to think using this rather different mindset across a whole range of different applications. I should also say that, as is common in these kinds of talks, I'm going to illustrate this using examples from my own research team, but I should acknowledge at the outset that similar ideas are pursued by many wonderful researchers and teams all around the world. I'm just picking examples that I'm particularly familiar with, but there's a one or two orders of magnitude more examples out there that I think illustrate this point. So to kick us off, I wanted to begin with a question, which is to ask, what is the greatest scientific discovery ever made? Now, I haven't given you a metric. I haven't said what I mean by greatest, so it's really just a matter of opinion, and you'll all have an opinion on this. Those opinions are equally valid. But to me, perhaps the most profound discovery that we've ever made in the history of science is the realization that our world, this wonderful universe, is described by mathematics. And if you think about it for a moment, it's not sort of obvious that by making little marks on a piece of paper, we can actually predict the future. It's sort of remarkable that mathematics describes the physical world, but it does. And it describes the world using very simple equations. The equations on this slide cover pretty much most everyday phenomena that you will encounter. And they're very simple. They'd all fit quite comfortably on one t-shirt. But not only are they very simple equations, they're much more than just sort of rough and ready models of the world. They work with exquisite precision. So here's an example. This is an electron, and the electron acts like a little magnet, and we can use some theory to calculate the strength of that magnet. And this is the result that we get, calculated here to very high precision. And you'll see there's some error bars because this calculation involves a perturbation expansion, and some terms have been neglected, and so we can estimate those terms. And so this is the theoretical prediction of the magnetic moment of the electron. And then we can do an experiment, and we can measure it. And in this case, we can also measure to very high precision. And this is the experimental result. And you'll see that within the error bars, the theory and experiment agree with this exquisite precision, or almost 13 significant figures. So those equations are extremely simple. They describe all of the everyday phenomena that we're interested in exploring, and they work with extreme precision. Not only that, they're actually, mathematics is also predictive. For example, the famous British theoretical physicist Paul Dirac, in developing a relativistic version of quantum physics, effectively took the square root of Schrödinger's equation. And you all know that, of course, for every positive square root, there's a negative square root. And so his equation, the Dirac equation, predicted that for the electron, there would be another particle of the same mass, but with a positive charge instead of a negative charge, and so on. He'd predicted theoretically the existence of antimatter. It was such an extraordinary prediction that he himself didn't believe it to start with, but then it was discovered experimentally. And so even something as exotic and remarkable as antimatter is a prediction of those very simple equations. So to me, this is the most profound thing that we found as scientists. And in fact, Dirac himself expressed this 100 years ago when he said, "The underlying physical laws necessary for the mathematical theory of a large part of physics and the whole of chemistry," and by the way, today we would say "and biochemistry," "are thus completely known." So this is really extraordinary. So, what's left to do? Well, the problem is, again, as stated by Dirac, The difficulty is only that the exact application of these laws leads to equations much too complicated to be soluble. In other words, the solution of those equations is extremely difficult for anything other than toy textbook examples. And so what I want to talk about in this talk is a very specific way in which AI, or more particularly deep learning, is transforming our ability to solve those equations. Now, I've used this rather fancy term, the fifth paradigm. So let me just explain where that comes from. So it's really inspired by this person. This is Jim Gray. He was a Turing Award winner, a Microsoft Technical Fellow, and a friend and colleague at Microsoft. He sadly died at far too young an age in a boating accident, but he leaves an amazing legacy. And he worked on large data scientific problems. And he observed that we appeared, as we went into the 21st century, we were entering what he described as the fourth paradigm. So let me briefly describe Jim Gray's notions of the paradigms of science. So the first and the most fundamental and the oldest paradigm of scientific discovery is just empirical. We observe the world and we observe there are irregularities in the world. So for example, if we draw a line between the sun and a planet, we observe that it sweeps out equal areas in equal intervals of time. So that's one of Kepler's laws. So it's a regularity that we observe in the solar system. And that's an empirical observation. Of course, we can use it to make predictions. But that's the first and the most ancient paradigm of science. And many of these kinds of regularities were observed. But then there was a breakthrough, and really this really took off in a big way, of course, with Newton, which is the theoretical paradigm, the realization that we could use mathematics to describe the world. Of course, Newton had to invent the calculus in order to have the right mathematical machinery to write down those descriptions. So this particular equation is Schrodinger's equation, which describes matter at the atomic level. So that's the theoretical. We talked about that quite a bit already. And the problem is we can write down these equations, they describe the world with tremendous precision, but solving them in practical settings is extremely challenging. Well, things got a lot better in the 1950s and beyond with the development of digital computers. And so we enter the third paradigm of scientific discovery, which is computational. We take those fundamental equations and we solve them on very large computers. The very first application of a digital computer was to simulate physics, and today simulation of physics, it remains one of the very important applications of digital computing. So that's the computational paradigm. What Jim Gray observed as we went into the 21st century was that the emergence again of a computationally driven paradigm, but one that's based on empirical data. He called it data-intensive scientific discovery. So the picture you see here is the ATLAS detector. It's at CERN, part of the Large Hadron Collider. You can just see in the foreground a person wearing a yellow hat to give you a sense of scale. This is the detector when it's partway through construction. By the time it's finished, that entire volume is crammed full of electronics and detectors and triggers and goodness knows what. It's sort of a massive cathedral to physics, really, all looking for microscopic phenomena using these gargantuan machines. And machines like this produce colossal amounts of data, something like 64 terabytes a second coming off the ATLAS detector, for example. And there are many other fields of science where observational data has really exploded. We can capture data at a very large scale, and that's driven a lot of exciting new science. What I think we're seeing now is a fifth paradigm, another framework. Again, it relies heavily on digital computation, but it has a rather different flavor to it. So you can think of this as really a mindset shift. So we have these very simple equations which we know describe the world with great precision, but it's very frustrating because we can't solve them in practical settings very easily. It's very expensive computationally to do so. So instead we do something different. Instead of solving the equations directly in order to make predictions, we use those equations to generate training data. And then we use that training data to train deep neural networks. And once that neural net is trained, we can view that as a deep learning emulator. So if we think of the code that solves the equation, in this case, Schrödinger's equation, we think of the code that solves Schrödinger's equation as a simulator, then what we have here is an emulator. Now, what's the point of this? Well, of course, it's still computationally expensive to generate all of that data. We still have to solve the basic equations to create the training set. So there's a computational cost in doing that. Then, of course, it's computationally expensive to train deep networks. There's a second computational cost. But once we've done that, the trained network is now very fast. So when we run inference, it's a single forward pass. Typically, it's extremely fast. So if we plan to use that emulator many, many times, we can amortize the cost of the data set generation and the cost of training the network over however many thousands, millions, billions of times that we're going to run that trained emulator. And so we can amortize that cost ever closer to zero. And of course, it's something we can't do in the third paradigm because if we solve the equations directly, every time we have a new problem to solve, we have to go back to the equations and solve them, and it's very expensive. And so that's the heart of the fifth paradigm, and it's very ubiquitous. It shows up in many, many different places, as I hope I'll show you in this talk, and it's quite substantial in its impact, quite transformational. So to summarize then, this is about training not on observational data or experimental data, but training on synthetic data generated by simulation of the fundamental equations of the universe. This data, of course, is richly and perfectly labeled. In an experiment, it can be harder to measure certain things than other things and impossible to measure some things. Whereas when we have a computer simulation, we can interrogate the output of that simulation and calculate whatever we like. So the labeling problem doesn't exist. Unlike, let's say, healthcare data, this is just solutions of equations. We don't have to deal with many of the complexities of things like GDPR and privacy associated with personal data and so on. And very importantly, the quantity of data is limited, I would say only in inverted commas, it's limited just by our compute budget. We can always go back and collect more data. We know that in the world of large language models, people worry that we've sort of run out of human-generated text and similar data. Here we can always create more data, and importantly, we can always create more data that has value. So we can always create more data that is useful. And so that I think is very exciting because of course machine learning is driven by data. One of the things we can do, we've been very successful at this in my team, and I know that other groups have done this as well, is to make use of underutilized compute resources. Let's imagine we're simulating molecules. We want to simulate larger numbers of molecules. Each of those simulations is an independent solution. So these can all run in parallel. So we have a sort of massively parallel data generation problem. We don't require those very large interconnected clusters of high-end GPUs that you need to train the latest LLM. Single GPUs can be fine. Even CPUs can work well. A lot of code still runs on CPUs. So we can run preemptible jobs massively parallel on underutilized or unutilized compute resources. And this has been fabulous for my team. We've been able to use compute that would, if we had to pay for it, even at internal costs, would cost tens of millions of dollars, but we're just using compute that would otherwise be sitting idle because of this massive parallelism. And of course, it runs at the lowest priority, but if it gets kicked off, doesn't matter, you're checkpointed, you just restart. And in this way, you can generate substantial data sets. So that again is very exciting. And here's the key thing, is that if nothing else, what we see is a massive acceleration compared to simulation. And I've put numbers here of 10 to the 3 and beyond. You'll see examples as we go through. But typically, in most applications, you'll get accelerations of a factor of several thousand at the same accuracy and spanning the same generality. And sometimes it can be substantially more. And in a factor of 1,000, can be a game changer. It can be really transformational. It's not often that you see a sort of step function like that where you can get a factors of 1,000 or more acceleration. So the idea of this fifth paradigm is not new. The terminology may be new, but people have been doing this for a very long time. And I thought I would begin my set of examples, as it were, with something that I was personally involved with over 30 years ago. Back then, I worked on the fusion program. So I began my career in quantum field theory as a theoretical physicist, and then I spent about 8 years or so working on the theory of tokamak plasmas as part of the fusion program. And so I was in an environment where there was a lot of data. This is what you see here is JET, the Joint European Torus. This is still the world's largest tokamak to have actually been switched on and operated, based just outside Oxford. And so I worked in the adjacent laboratory in the theoretical physics division. But there was an abundant source of data. This was large data by the standards of the day. Due to all the diagnostics, this machine, what you see here is the machine soon after construction. Within a few years, the machine itself was invisible because it was covered in so many different diagnostic systems, lasers and interferometers and all kinds of things. So lots and lots of interesting data to be analyzed. And this was the time when Hinton published the backprop paper. I got very excited about neural nets and started applying neural networks to analyzing the data from tokamaks such as JET. But this particular project, which was the last project that I led before I left the fusion program and switched to machine learning full time, was a project to do real-time control of the plasma in a tokamak. So we actually worked with a much smaller machine called Compass, and this is just a little diagram of what goes on inside a tokamak. It's a sort of donut-shaped vacuum chamber containing a small amount of hydrogen. I mean, even in jet, it's only a few grams, heated up to a temperature of 100 or 200 million degrees. And it's trapped inside a magnetic bottle. And the magnetic bottle is produced by all of these intersecting coils, the big toroidal field coils and then the outer poloidal field coils, produce this sort of helical magnetic structure that traps and confines the plasma. And the goal, of course, is that the hydrogen will fuse to produce helium and release abundant clean energy. That's the goal of fusion. Now, this is a photograph of the inside of this now much smaller tokamak called Compass, stands for Compact Assembly. And this is a tokamak in an adjacent building to JET, a small experimental facility. And it was built in large part to study the effect of plasma shape. So what you see here are cross sections through that donut showing different shapes of plasma. So most plasmas were, in the early days, were circular cross-section, as you see in the top left, but you can elongate it and even make it into this kidney bean shape. And that improves the confinement properties of the plasma. It allows the plasma to trap the heat in and takes us a step closer to fusion. So Compass was really, in large part, about exploring these different shapes. Now, in the spirit of things we've talked about already, in the case of plasma shapes in tokamaks, we have an equation that describes them. It's not a fundamental equation of physics. You derive this starting from Maxwell's equation, but it's called the Grad-Shafronov equation. It's a second-order elliptic partial differential equation, and it describes the magnetic field structure within the plasma. So in particular, it will describe the shape of the plasma boundary. So again, we have this very simple equation. It gives a very accurate description of the plasma shape. And so we ought to be able to control the shape if we could solve this equation in real time. So that's sort of the goal. Could we solve this equation in real time? Well, it turns out that it's very difficult. So the first thing to understand is that this project was done 30 years ago. So you've got to unwind 30 years of Moore's law. So it's a little hard to imagine today because I'm sure this would all run fine on your wristwatch. But back then, creating a single solution of the Grad-Shafronov equation for just one shape of plasma would take a couple of minutes on a high-end workstation. And the problem is we needed to do real-time feedback control. We needed to do that with a frequency around 50 kilohertz. So that means that direct solution of the equation on a workstation is about 6 orders of magnitude too slow. So what we did is something different, something in the spirit of the fifth paradigm. We generated thousands of solutions offline on a Silicon Graphics workstation, and then we used those solutions to train a neural network. Now, again, this is a very primitive neural network. It's a two-layer, we'd call them multi-layer perceptrons, with a two-layer network with a single layer of sigmoidal hidden units. So very simple. The problem we're solving here is not linear, but it's not wildly nonlinear. It's a smoothly varying nonlinear surface. So the two-layer network is able actually to learn quite an accurate solution. But of course, once it's trained, we can now make inference in that network very quickly. It's just a single forward pass of the trained network. So how do we use the network? Well, we use it in a feedback loop. So the tokamak, the plasma, the vacuum vessel, is surrounded by dozens of small magnetic coils, and these detect the strength and the orientation of the magnetic field at lots of positions around the outside of the plasma. And it's those signals that form the input to the neural network. And the network is trained to produce as its output some parameters that describe the position and shape of the plasma, the radial and vertical position of the center, and its radius and its elongation and triangularity and so on. So a handful of parameters that describe the shape of the plasma boundary. What we'd like to do is to create a plasma, let's say starts off with a circular cross-section, because that's the easiest one to produce. And then over time, during the pulse, during the period of existence of the plasma, we'd like to stretch it out and reshape it. So what we have are desired values for those position and shape parameters, and they may vary over time. And then what we do is we look at the difference between the desired parameters at any moment of time and the values predicted by the output of the neural network. And that difference is an error signal. And we can send the error signal to some big control amplifiers, which change the very large currents through those toroidal and poloidal field coils, and can therefore in real time shape the plasma and move it back towards the desired value. And that's done with a thing called a PID, proportional integral differential linear controller. So the control piece is purely linear here. The nonlinearity is in the neural network. So that allowed us to do what was the world's first real-time feedback control of a tokamak plasma using a neural network. And one of the ways we were able to get 6 orders of magnitude acceleration, 3 to 4 of those came from the fifth paradigm in using a neural network. But even that wasn't enough, and we had to go one step further. We actually built a dedicated, fully parallel neural network implementation. As I said, today this would all be a gazillionth of the capability of one GPU, but back in the day it allowed us to do that real-time feedback control. So, but the parallel hardware alone would not have been enough. The key was to generate synthetic data and use that to train a deep learning emulator. So that's an early example of the fifth paradigm, although we didn't call it that at the time, of course. So let's bring things a little bit more up to date and give a different example. Atmospheric modeling, weather forecasting. We all go to the phone and we look up a weather forecast. Where does that come from? It comes from solving equations. Again, not fundamental equations of nature, but derived equations, things like the Navier-Stokes equations, which describe fluid flow. And of course, we want to solve these equations on a fine grid and in order to get good spatial accuracy, and at fine time steps in order to get accurate predictions. And we have to solve those equations quickly because we have to solve them faster than the real weather is evolving. So we initialize with the current weather, and then we solve those equations through time more rapidly than the real weather is evolving, and that gives us a forecast. And so to do that, we need supercomputers. So these weather forecasts run on massive supercomputers. They're computationally very, very expensive. But it makes it a perfect target for the fifth paradigm because it means over the last few decades, large weather centers around the world have been running these supercomputer simulations and generating a huge amount of synthetic data generated by solving those equations. And we can use that to train emulators. A number of people have done this. Anima, who gave the first talk yesterday, was one of the pioneers in this space, and several others have done this. And what they found is 3 or 4 orders of magnitude acceleration in the ability to forecast the weather with no loss of accuracy. And if you're paying for a big supercomputer, an acceleration of a factor of a few thousand is a very, very big deal indeed. We also contributed to this work. Our approach was to create something which we called Aurora, which was more generally looking at atmospheric modeling. And the idea here was to go beyond an emulator of a single simulator and instead to create a foundation model. And that's done by training the network on very diverse data from different simulators, different regions, and so on, trying to force the model to learn some deeper understanding of atmospheric flows. And the point about a foundation model, of course, is that we can fine-tune it. This is actually a little video. I'm not sure how well the video's playing over the internet, but this shows one application of Aurora, which is to fine-tune the model to deal with atmospheric pollution and the flows of atmospheric pollution. With the weather, of course, there are many sensors. Lots of buildings have wind sensors and rain sensors on, and aeroplanes are measuring wind speed all the time, and so on. There are lots and lots of sensors for weather around the world, far fewer sensors for pollution. So we can use a small amount of pollution data to fine-tune the foundation model, and this gives state-of-the-art prediction in the flows of pollution around the atmosphere. So that's a sort of everyday scale, if you like, example of the power of the fifth paradigm, and it's having quite a transformational effect on weather forecasting and atmospheric modeling more generally. A lot of what my team is interested in these days is down at the molecular level, molecules, materials, proteins, and so on. Where, as you saw through Schrodinger's equation, we have a very precise and very simple description of the world at the molecular level, but there's tremendous frustration that it's so expensive to arrive at solutions. And so this is a wonderful place to think about applying the fifth paradigm, because developing new molecules and new materials, new stable configurations of atoms has so many, many potential applications. And I've just shown a few examples on this slide. And the space that we're exploring here is gargantuan. If you just take small organic molecules that have drug-like characteristics, that space is about 10 to the power 60, roughly the number of atoms in the solar system, I believe. It's a gargantuan space, and in that space, there may be all kinds of amazing drugs waiting to be found, but we have to have an efficient way of exploring that space, and likewise with new materials and many other applications. So here's an example of the application of the fifth paradigm. This is to a generative model now, and it's a generative model for materials, for inorganic crystalline materials. It's called MatterGen. And this is a diffusion model. So I think we're all familiar with diffusion models for images. You take photographs, images of cats and dogs and bicycles. You take each image and you incrementally add more and more noise to the image until eventually it's degraded into pure noise. And so you have this sequence of images getting more and more noisy, and you train a neural net to take one of those images as input and produce the previous one as output. In other words, you train the neural network to take a somewhat noisy image and denoise it to produce a slightly less noisy image. And of course, by that noising process, you quickly create large amounts of training data, labeled training data. And so once the network is trained, you feed it with pure noise as the input, and it denoises it and produces images that are sampled from the distribution of images that it was trained on. And so, sorry about that. This is a little video showing that denoising process. So we are denoising with respect to the choice of atoms, that is which element each atom is, the positions of the atoms within the unit cell, and then the three vectors that define the shape of the unit cell. And so this unit cell is now repeated infinitely in all directions. But we want to do a little bit more than that, not just generate crystals, stable crystals, but also to generate materials that have particular properties. And so we use a technique called classified free guidance to be able to provide additional inputs that specify things like the mechanical properties or the magnetic properties or the electronic properties, and to denoise to materials that hopefully have those properties. And again, if this video is playing, what you'll be seeing on the screen is a sort of smorgasbord of lots of different materials having different specific properties generated through MatterGen. Now, if you think about exploring the space of crystalline materials, it's also just like the space of organic molecules. It's a gargantuan space. We can use techniques from the fifth paradigm. We have in order to take a molecule as input and predict its properties very quickly and very efficiently. And we can use that to sift through millions of candidates to find a material that has the desired properties. So think of that as a way of sifting through a haystack, testing each piece of hay to see if it looks like a needle. Think of MatterGen as a way of telling you which region of the haystack to look in. So this generates materials that already, roughly speaking, have the kinds of properties that we're looking for, and we can apply screening to those. And so this compounds that acceleration. We get orders of magnitude acceleration by only looking in the region of chemical space where we think there are good solutions. And then as we screen through those candidates, we again get orders of magnitude acceleration again, because each of those screenings can be done with a trained emulator. So this is very exciting, and that's just one domain. Before I talk about some other examples, let me just step back for a moment and just ask what it is we're trying to do here. And it reveals a fundamental trade-off between three different things. So of course we want high accuracy. We want answers quickly and affordably, so speed is important. But we also need to generalize, so generality is important. If we can only look at a very, very narrow class of particular drug molecules, it might still be useful, but it's much more interesting if we could look at, say, all drug-like molecules. And there's a trade-off between speed, accuracy, and generality. And if you push hard on one, then generally you pay a price somewhere else. I just want to say a little bit more about the accuracy. The accuracy that we dream of in the world of chemistry is sometimes called chemical accuracy. Loosely speaking, it turns out to be a kilocalorie per mole in those rather strange units that chemists like to use. And it's very hard to achieve. The reason we want chemical accuracy, or roughly speaking, what it means is that if we have chemical accuracy, we no longer we can predict the outputs of experiments. We can calculate quantities with the same error that an experiment has. And so if we can reach chemical accuracy, we can replace lots of slow, laborious, noisy, expensive, complicated wet lab chemistry with computational experiments. And so chemical accuracy is a very important goal. And it's hard to achieve because we need very high precision. So here's a little, I don't know if you like these little analogies or not, but imagine we want to find out how much does the captain weigh on this boat. Then we could do it by weighing the boat with the captain, and then we could weigh the boat again without the captain, and we could subtract them, and mathematically that gives us the weight of the captain. That's mathematically correct. But obviously the problem is, in order to get a reasonably accurate value for the weight of the captain, we need to be able to make that weight measurement with very, very high precision, because the boat's very heavy and the captain, relatively speaking, is very light. And so that's the challenge we face in the molecular world. That's why it's so extremely difficult. It's tremendously compelling to be able to tackle this problem, but it is also immensely challenging. There's one approximation that holds extremely well, and we almost invariably always make this approximation. It's called the Born-Oppenheimer approximation, and it just follows from the observation that protons and neutrons, which comprise the nuclei of atoms, are about 2,000 times as massive as the electron. And so that means that to a very good approximation, we can treat the nuclei as classical particles, and we only need to treat the electrons quantum mechanically. And that's a huge simplification. We don't need to treat the nuclei quantum mechanically. And again, if you like little analogies, here's one for you. So if you imagine a cow, the cow is like the nucleus of an atom. It's very heavy, but it's surrounded by this cloud of flies, and the flies are like the electrons. And if the cow goes for a walk across the field, the cow is walking very slowly, but the electrons, or in this case, the flies are buzzing around very quickly, but that cloud of flies follows the cow as the cow walks across the field. So that's a little bit like the Born-Oppenheimer approximation. And so if we think about a molecule, this is the caffeine molecule. It's made of just carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, simple organic molecule. We can treat the nuclei as fixed, or we can treat them as parameters. So we're given the positions and the identities of all the nuclei, and then the quantum mechanical task we have to solve is to work out what the electrons are doing. Now, so the electrons are kind of like the glue that's holding this molecule together. Well, the electrons are described by an object called the wave function. The wave function is a solution of Schrödinger's equation. It's usually denoted psi, and it depends upon the positions and the spin as well. We won't discuss that too much today, but it depends on the positions of all the electrons. So if there are capital N electrons in the molecule, then psi is a function jointly of the positions of all n electrons. And so it lives in a very high dimensional space, and that makes it very hard to solve. In fact, in general, the cost of computing psi exactly by solving Schrödinger's equation grows exponentially with the number of electrons. And again, I can give you a little sort of sense of why that might be. Imagine we solve this by taking that space and dividing it up into a grid. So if there are n electrons, it's a 3n dimensional space. So if we grid up a space in one dimension, that's easy. In 2 dimensions, not a problem. But you can see as we go to higher dimensions, the number of grid points in our space is growing exponentially. So if we had 1,000 points in each axis, it'll be 1,000 points in 1 dimension, 1,000,000 in 2 dimensions, 1,000,000,000 in 3, and so on. So the number of grid points on which we're solving this would grow exponentially with the dimensionality of the space. Now, obviously, that's not how we solve Schrödinger's equation, but the principle is there that as we increase the number of electrons, the cost, in worst case, grows exponentially. And it means something like this humble caffeine molecule, a rather small molecule. It's got a couple of dozen atoms, has about 100 electrons. That's already out of reach. We can't, in any practical sense, solve Schrödinger's equation directly for even something as small as the caffeine molecule. So it's very frustrating. We've got these beautiful equations. They describe the world extremely accurately and precisely, and yet we can't even solve them for very small problems, let alone something complicated like a drug molecule binding to a protein. Well, there was a major breakthrough in the mid-1960s. It's sometimes called the biggest free lunch in science, or the most important theory that you've never heard of. It's called DFT, or density functional theory. And so let me briefly explain what that is. It's based on the observation that we don't actually need to calculate the full wave function. It turns out the quantities of interest can be calculated from a much simpler object, which is the electron density. That's just the total density, charge density, if you like, of electrons, and it's a function only of 3-dimensional space. And it turns out that this reduces the cost from being exponential in the number of electrons to being just cubic, which obviously is a dramatic improvement. But what's extraordinary, of course, we're familiar with lots of problems that are exponential, and we're familiar with lots of clever algorithms that give us approximate solutions that have some sort of polynomial cost. That's all very well known in computer science. But what's remarkable here is that this is exact. This reduction from exponential to cubic is exact. It's an extraordinary result. It's so extraordinary that Walter Kohn, who was one of the creators of density functional theory, actually won the Nobel Prize, chemistry Nobel Prize, I think in 1998, for the development of density functional theory. And density functional theory is pretty much the only practical way we have of solving Schrödinger's equation for real world scenarios. Because it's of such great importance, you can see here that the number of citations of density functional theory has been growing dramatically. I believe this is the most highly cited piece of work in physics, in fact. And you can see the citations really begin to take off in the 1990s. Although it was developed in 1965, it was really only the 1990s with the advent of faster computers that it became a truly practical method. And today, it accounts for the overwhelming majority of practical calculations at the molecular scale. This pie chart is taken from one of the national labs in the US, and it's a supercomputer facility. And this is the breakdown of different scientific simulations. And you can see that actually density functional theory is accounting for about a third of all of the workloads. Again, if you like these little cartoons, they're only rough analogies, but this gives you a sense of density functional theory. You can think of this is an actual photograph, by the way, and the plastic molymod is some very complicated thing there. So some really complicated object. That's like the wave function. It's living in this three-dimensional space. And if we know the wave function, we know everything there is about the system. But it turns out we don't need to calculate that wave function. We only need this sort of lower dimensional shadow, like this projection onto 2 dimensions in this case. And it turns out that lower dimensional shadow, the electron density just living in 3 dimensions, gives us everything we need. And a big thank you to the person who spent several hours plugging bits of plastic together to make the shadow work out on that one. Okay, so this all sounds far too good to be true. So there's got to be a catch somewhere. How can we go from exponential to cubic? It's exact. There's got to be a catch. Well, the catch comes with one of the terms in the equations of density functional theory, and it's a term called the exchange correlation functional. It's a functional of the densities. So rho is the density function. And so the density function is input and it outputs a number which is a contribution to the energy of the molecule. It's called the exchange correlation functional. Cohn showed it's actually universal. So it doesn't depend upon the particular choice of nuclei, the particular problem we're solving. It's a universal functional. So that's rather remarkable that it exists, that it's universal. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to write down an explicit form for the exchange correlation functional. So we know it exists, we know it's universal, we just don't know what it looks like. And so in the half century or so since density functional theory was conceived, lots of people have come up with handcrafted approximations, leading to a whole zoo of these density functionals. You can see B3 lip there is the most popular. There's about 800 of these. And they trade off between accuracy and cost. And the problem is the more accurate ones have scaling that's worse than cubic. Some of them enter the 4th, enter the 5th, and so on. So they can be very expensive in order to achieve high accuracy. So we've lost some of the magic of density functional theory. And also each handcrafted function only works with limited accuracy, only over some region of chemical space. It's a bit of an art to decide which functional you should use or maybe invent a new one. It's not very satisfactory. And yet we know there exists this universal functional. An article in Science about 3 years ago referred to it as the divine functional. And it talked about being in pursuit of the divine functional, how we've lost the spirit of DFT by going after this endless zoo of different handcrafted functionals. Can we get back to that search for the divine functional? So what does DFT look like today? Well, this is a graph of accuracy on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis is the cost, expressed as scaling. The vertical axis is kilocalories per mole, so that magic number of 1, that's called chemical accuracy. So the goal is to be down in the blue region. and you'll see some of these different functionals. And they're sometimes organized on a ladder called Jacob's ladder. And the bottom of Jacob's ladder, you have very cheap ones that are not very accurate. As you go up the ladder, you get more and more expensive ones. So going up the ladder is like going from right to left on this diagram. We have more and more features. Going from left to right. So as we add more and more features, the error comes down, the accuracy improves, but as you can see, the cost and the scaling get worse. So that's where we are today with that unfortunate trade-off. And yet we know there's a universal functional that should give us cubic scaling and chemical accuracy. So the obvious question is, can we not use machine learning to learn that functional? Instead of crafting one by hand, let's just learn it using the fifth paradigm. And so people have tried this, a number of people have tried this, but they've used handcrafted features. And they've achieved functionals which are accurate, but sometimes they're too slow, maybe 2 orders of magnitude too slow to be of practical value. You can think of this a bit like machine learning in the days before deep learning, back in the days when I was doing the tokamak control, for example. You handcraft some features, then use a shallow neural network to combine them together non-linearly. So why are people? And one other thing that's very important here is locality. We know the exchange correlation functional depends on the density non-locally. It's not just a local function of the density. And so these more accurate functionals use handcrafted features that build in non-locality. So the non-locality arises just through the handcrafted features. Well, why do people do it that way? Well, the reason is most public data has low accuracy. The data that's available publicly doesn't have sufficient accuracy to be able to train an exchange correlation functional to get to chemical accuracy. The amount of high accuracy data is very limited, probably only about 20,000 molecules, and they also lack diversity for various reasons. So the core of the project that we embarked on 3 years ago has been to create new data, to generate data specifically for training an emulator, for training an exchange correlation model. And so we've created data that's a highly accurate data with high diversity, an order of magnitude larger than previous. And I want to make a call out here to Amir Khartan, who's an external collaborator. We turned to world experts on the accurate generation of quantum chemistry data in order to have the very best quality of data for training. So labeling those, for each molecule, we have to compute the energy, and getting those energy labels involves these expensive quantum chemistry calculations with some sophisticated methods, couple cluster, single, double, triple is one of the well-known examples, very expensive, finicky to use, complex to use, but it does give us highly accurate data. And as I mentioned earlier, we've been able to do this using preemptible compute, which is fabulous. And by having a much larger data set, we've been able to explore for the first time a true deep learning approach in which we learn the features rather than handcraft them. So far, we've focused on main group molecules, so not the transition metals and just molecules, not crystals. We're currently working on adding in transition metals and adding in looking at periodic structures as well. And a little bit of a technical point here, but we expect and have seen that we can generalize to larger molecules, both through the self-consistent field equations of density functional theory, which capture a lot of the physics of quantum chemistry, and also because the exchange correlation function is universal. And so we're very excited about this machine learning approach. So we've released our first machine learned, deep learned exchange correlation function. It's called Scala, which comes from the Italian for ladder, but also has implications of scale. And the way this works as follows. It has to take electron density as input and produce the energy as output. Now, if you think about the ship and the captain again, there are some big terms in the energy. There's the Coulomb interaction between the electrons or between the electrons and the nuclei, and we can just calculate those directly. But we need also the exchange correlation term because we need to achieve that very high precision. And so the deep neural network takes the electron density and it learns the non-locality. So essentially what happens is the electron density is represented on a fine point cloud, maybe 1 million points. That's fairly typical in this field. But what we now introduce is a coarse set of group of points. Those are co-located with the nuclei. And we use message passing from the fine grid points to the coarse grid points and then back out again to produce a learnable non-locality. And here are some results from the first version of Scala. So both axes represent error. The vertical axis is atomization energies, which we have a large amount of data. Most of our data is atomization energy. And you can see on atomization energy, we've achieved chemical accuracy. We all have a small amount of data on things like reactions and conformations and so on. And even with that small amount of data, we're achieving very competitive accuracy. And it's compared here with other methods, which you can see not only have, for the most part, less accuracy, but also have quartic rather than cubic scaling. So we're really excited by this. We haven't yet found the universal functional, but we've taken a big step towards it and given ourselves a lot of encouragement that deep learning really can solve this half-century-old grand challenge of science. So you can read about this on Archive. There's a separate paper about the data generation because it's very important. And also this has been open sourced, and there's also a research early access program where a small number of users can get some white glove treatment to help apply Scala in practical settings. So let me finish then with one last topic. As we try to scale this up to bigger and bigger molecules, how far can we go? Can we go as far as biology and proteins? Well, it turns out that we can. So this is the whole of molecular biology in one slide. And apologies to David Baker and other experts in this space. But in essence, sequence is at the heart of this. The DNA sequence codes for the RNA sequence, and in turn codes for the protein sequence. So Fred Sanger got the Nobel Prize for sequencing proteins and another Nobel Prize for sequencing DNA. And that sequence, of course, determines structure. You saw the Nobel Prize last year for this. But what we're really interested in is function, and function is determined by structure, but not by static structures alone. So the function of proteins is very dynamical. This is the ATP energy cycle, very fundamental to living organisms, and it involves a protein that's constantly opening and closing. Proteins are very dynamical things. They move around, and that movement determines their function. Again, we know the fundamental equations, and they're very simple. We can solve them. It's called molecular dynamics, and the idea is very simple. You take your molecule or molecules, each atom has a position and a velocity, and then you simply update the position and velocity through time using Newton's second law of motion. It's as simple as that. And so you just integrate Newton's second law of motion. The problem, though, is that the force, the gradient of the energy, is determined quantum mechanically by the electrons. So at every time step, you should have to solve Schrödinger's equation. So every time step is going to be very expensive. But it's much worse than that because of something called the curse of sequentiality. This shows that the fundamental time step has to capture what Feynman called the wiggling and jiggling of atoms, the bond vibrations and rotations and so on. Those happen on a femtosecond time scale.
Chris, I need to interrupt you. We are running out of time.
I'm sorry. I'm nearly at my last
This is
slide.
fascinating. My sad job is to keep time.
Thank you. No, I'm nearly there. Let's just say that you'd have to simulate anything up to 10 to the 15 sequential steps. So by using the fifth paradigm and by carefully segmenting up the protein, we've been able to run molecular dynamics simulations on up to 10,000 atoms. And then my final slide, that work was done about a year ago. This is work that was published a couple of months ago, and we're very happy that it even made the front cover of Science, which is going a step further and actually building an emulator of that dynamics. By training on molecular dynamics, you can actually produce an emulator that avoids molecular dynamics altogether and directly samples the different conformations of the proteins. So with that, my apologies for overrunning slightly, but thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, Chris, so this was fantastic. And so you gave us truly a roadmap and a very clear picture of at least of your perspective, which is wonderful. We have no time for questions. In fact, I will ask you one question. And that's a question that many of us in academia have in our mind, and you are uniquely positioned to give us your perspective, which is what's the role of academia versus industry in this moment, and what are the partnerships we should look for how do we, in academia, get set up to be maximally impactful? Yeah.
I think it's a great question, and I think you answered it yourself with the word partnership. The DFT work is a beautiful example, and we come with expertise in machine learning, with very large-scale compute resources, but there's a lot of domain knowledge, for example, that's needed. And I mentioned there the collaborations with people with very deep domain expertise. I think in science, it's very risky for a machine learning team to know just enough to be dangerous about the domain. I think that's a very risky place. You have to work with deep domain experts who really understand the subtleties and complexities of sometimes century-old science. So the Scala the DFT function was a great example of a partnership between industry and academia. I think those partnerships are going to be really key going forward.
Wonderful, thank you. This was a great answer, and I hope to see you soon in person, Chris. Thank you for talking to us, and I don't know if you can see the audience. Everybody was on the edge of their chair during your presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Pietro. Really appreciate it. Thank you.